Number 30.5, Booker T. So it turns out when I made this list, I forgot to include Booker T's 2013 induction. By the time I figured it out, I didn't want to try and remember everything, so here we are. Anyway, Booker T will go down as one of the single most decorated performers in wrestling history, scooping up dozens of tag team and singles championships in WCW and WWE, including 6 runs as world champion across both companies. After becoming one of the top players in Atlanta, he went through an awkward transition period in the World Wrestling Federation in the wake of the buyout, before eventually finding his footing. The Booker man remained a consistently entertaining presence for the rest of his lengthy career, whether as a member of the Invasion, teaming up with Goldust to hilarious results, completely reinventing himself as King Booker, or just as himself. A man who blew through the glass ceiling in World Championship Wrestling, and who had a pretty decent run in WWE when it was all said and done, Booker T defined professionalism and excellence to an entire generation of fans and future wrestlers from the Monday Night War and beyond. Number 30, D-Generation X. When people ask what made the Monday Night War such a unique time to be a wrestling fan, many will point to the success of D-Generation X in the late 90s. The original pairing of Shawn Michaels and Triple H in China in 1997 played a huge role in ushering in the edgy content that the World Wrestling Federation made millions off of at the height of their war with WCW. When Michaels went down with an injury after WrestleMania 14 the following year, DX not only survived but thrived, adding X-Pac and the New Age Outlaws into the fold. Throw in some more wacky antics like trying to invade WCW and CNN, and by that summer, the group was one of the biggest bunch of baby faces in the company. A few reunions and a Hall of Fame induction later, these days WWE tends to overstate the influence the group had in their day, but it's not by much. For the target audience at the time, DX was one of the biggest things the company had to offer, a perfect example of what the Attitude Era was all about. Number 29, Mil Mascaras. When it comes to the history of Lucha Libre in Mexico, there are 3 big names who come to mind: El Santo, Blue Demon, and our next inductee, Mil Mascaras. Mascaras was considered one of the larger luchadors of his day. Traditionally a mat grappler in his homeland, he was also considered one of wrestling's first high flyers after wowing audiences in Japan with his aerial moves. His work in that country helped inspire a legion of masked wrestlers from there, including Ultimo Dragon, Jushin Liger, and the Great Sasuke. He was the first man to wrestle in Madison Square Garden under a mask. The State Athletic Commission originally had a ban on masked wrestlers, but it was lifted specifically for him. And as was seemingly custom at the time, Mil Mascaras has also starred in more than a dozen Mexican action films, all while wearing his mask. If it weren't for the contributions of Mil Mascaras, Lucha Libre as we know it could have turned out very different. Number 28, Bob Backlund. An All-American athlete, in his prime, Bob Backlund was the textbook definition of a white meat babyface. Beginning his career in 1973, Backlund initially debuted for Verne Gagne's American Wrestling Association, then moved around the country working for various territories before moving to the WWF. After multiple title matches, Backlund would finally unseat superstar Billy Graham to become the world champion. During his time as champion, Bob would frequently wrestle world champs from other companies, such as Harley Race, Ric Flair, and Nick Bockwinkel. Despite some controversial finishes with Antonio Inoki and Greg Valentine, Bob would go on to officially be the second longest reigning champion in company history, carrying the title all the way until 1983 when he lost to the Iron Sheik. Backlund would eventually leave the company, but returned in 1992, eventually morphing from a goody two-shoes to a deranged old man who would snap at the slightest opportunity. In a shocker, he'd actually become WWF champion again in 1994 after beating Bret Hart in a submission match. He would eventually move into a manager role, which he's done on and off as recently as 2017. Number 27, Jake Roberts. Jake Roberts was never a physically intimidating man during his days as a wrestler. Tall and lanky with not a whole lot of muscle to spare, those who didn't follow wrestling might not have given him a second glance. But that all changed once Roberts opened his mouth. To many, he is the poster child for the power of the promo. Speaking intelligently, but not in a condescending way, Roberts was able to draw viewers into his world with his artful style of interview. After wrestling for several southeastern territories, Roberts further honed his craft in Stampede Wrestling before making one final stop in Mid-South and ultimately signing with the World Wrestling Federation. Though he never won a single championship there, he captivated audiences with his steely glare and his devastating DDT finisher. A career that unfortunately self-destructed due to Roberts' personal demons, Jake the Snake's finally been able to clean up his act and was inducted into the Hall of Fame in 2014. Number 26, the Fabulous Freebirds. Originally beginning with Michael Hayes and Terry Gordy, everything clicked once the Freebirds added Buddy Roberts to the mix. After cutting their teeth in Bill Watts' Mid-South Wrestling and then the Continental Wrestling Association in Memphis, the Freebirds really blew up during their feud with the Von Erich family in World Class Championship Wrestling. The group would carry on with different federations across the country, including a brief pit stop in the Federation before eventually finding more success in WCW, though their roster had changed a bit with the addition of Jimmy Garvin and the departure of Gordy and Roberts. Despite the change-ups, the Freebirds were iconic iconic for a number of reasons. They were one of the first examples of wrestlers coming out to entrance music, and they helped revolutionize the concept of the three-man team in wrestling that is now all but commonplace. Michael Hayes has been a long-standing, influential member of creative in WWE for years, and lest we forget, they're also the inventors of the Freebird rule, which is still used widely to this day. Number 25. Ernie Ladd. Originally a defensive tackle for the San Diego Chargers in the NFL, Ernie Ladd entered the world of pro wrestling as a publicity stunt in 1961. By 1969, he'd make it his full-time career, working for the WWF and the NWA territories all the way up until the mid-1980s. He's perhaps best known for being the first black man in wrestling to portray a heel, an idea that was simply unheard of during the civil rights era of the 1960s. With a surly gift of gab and his large frame befitting the nickname Big Cat, Ladd was able to tap into the anger of the crowds and use it to his advantage as a performer. Ladd would briefly transition to commentary in the Federation in 1986 after retiring from in-ring competition before leaving the company altogether that same year. For many years, he was the first and only man to have been inducted into both the WCW and WWE Halls of Fame. Number 24. Bill Watts. The aforementioned Ernie Ladd owes a fair amount of his success to this next inductee. Cowboy Bill Watts spent nearly 2 decades as a wrestler, but perhaps more than that, he's best known for his time holding the pencil. In 1979, Watts began running shows for Mid-South Wrestling, which he eventually renamed the Universal Wrestling Federation in an attempt to go national. This is not to be confused with the UWF that Herb Abrams ran in the 1990s. As the booker, the Cowboy gave many stars opportunities to shine, including Ladd, the Junkyard Dog, Sting, Ted DiBiase, Jake Roberts, and Hacksaw Jim Duggan. After the UWF was bought out by Jim Crockett Promotions, Watts became the executive vice president of WCW in 1992. To the chagrin of some, Watts' early changes to company culture were tied to his following of old-school tradition, including a lack of pads on the outside of the ring and requiring faces and heels to dress in separate areas. He also forced his son Eric onto the wrestling world before he was ready, proving that nepotism is as old school as it gets. But to his credit, he's also the man responsible for Ron Simmons becoming the first official African-American world champion in wrestling history. Watts would leave WCW in controversial fashion after some racially charged statements from an old interviewer dug up. He worked briefly in the WWF as a member of creative soon after, before getting out of the game altogether. Number 23. Harley Race. When it's all said and done, Harley Race will go down as one of the toughest wrestlers to have ever laced up a pair of boots, and justifiably so. Having survived polio at an early age, Race trained to wrestle as a teenager, coming up through the ranks until a car crash put him on the shelf. Not only did his pregnant wife die in the crash, he nearly had his leg amputated until the promoter he was working for intervened. Race eventually recovered and spent several years working for the AWA alongside partners like Larry Hennig and Hardboiled Haggerty before working for the NWA in the 70s. He'd go on to become an 8-time World Heavyweight Champion, feuding with the likes of the Funk Brothers, Ric Flair, and Dusty Rhodes. He also spent 3 years in the World Wrestling Federation, where he famously bleached his hair blonde and became King Harley Race, with the company making no mention of his past accolades. He'd go on to become a top manager in WCW during the early 1990s before retiring due to injuries. He's currently promoting World League Wrestling based out of Missouri and also runs his own acclaimed wrestling school. Number 22. Pat Patterson. Known for having one of the greatest minds of the business, Pat Patterson transitioned from wrestler to backstage official seamlessly upon retiring from in-ring action in 1984. Serving as Vince McMahon's right-hand man for many years, Patterson's known for having invented the idea of the Royal Rumble match and also for choreographing the title versus title match between Hulk Hogan and the Ultimate Warrior at WrestleMania 6, which turned out to be a classic in its own right. Of course, Patterson's also known for being the first ever Intercontinental Champion, a title which has done pretty well for itself over the years. Older fans treat Pat like a demigod for his work in the San Francisco territory, where he earned much of his fame in the 1970s, teaming with Ray Stevens as part of the Blonde Bombers. Number 21. Sting. When it comes to heroes in wrestling, no, not heroes of wrestling, few can match what Sting brought to the table for so many years. With the chiseled physique, bright neon face paint, and a never-say-die attitude in the ring, Sting was the epitome of awesomeness for kids and adults alike in Jim Crockett Promotions and WCW. What made Sting such a great performer was his ability to evolve with the times as the business changed around him. As the New World Order took over WCW, Sting eschewed his bright and friendly image and traded in for a darker look, heavily inspired by Brandon Lee's Crow character. Not only did the look stick, it's carried with him for more of his career than the Surfer look ever did. A multiple-time world champion in WCW and in TNA, Sting was one of the few people who never jumped to WWE during or after the Monday Night War, only for him to finally arrive in late 2014 to feud with Triple H and the Authority. That didn't end so well, but it was still cool to see him there. Number 20 and a half, the Brisco Brothers. Yep, I forgot about these guys too. Anyway, in their primes, the two are known to be some of the most legitimate grapplers in the business due to their extensive amateur backgrounds. In the pros, Jack and Jerry dominated the tag team scene across Florida, Georgia, and the Mid-Atlantic. Older brother Jack would even become a three-time NWA World Champion. In 1984, the brothers unknowingly played a role in the early battle between the World Wrestling Federation and World Championship Wrestling, when they sold their majority stake in Georgia Championship Wrestling to Vince McMahon, setting off what would be known to many fans as Black Saturday. After retiring from wrestling full-time, younger brother Jerry became a tenured backstage official in the Federation, helping discover some of the greatest talent to work for the company in the modern era. Jerry's also known for his hilarious performance as one half of the Stooges alongside Pat Patterson. Number 20, the Four Horsemen. Over the decades, there have been a lot of stables that claim to be the best, but this foursome is unquestionably at the top. Originally forming in 1985, the group of Ric Flair, Arn and Ole Anderson, Tully Blanchard, and J.J. Dillon as manager ran roughshod over their competition in the National Wrestling Alliance, often holding all the major championships and living a life of opulence. While the Nature Boy and the Enforcer were the constants, other members would shuffle around. Lex Luger, Sting, Barry Windham, Chris Benoit, and Dean Malenko are just some of the men who became Horsemen at some point over the years, but by and large the mission statement remained the same. The Horsemen may not have been the first heel stable in wrestling, but they did completely revamp the concept and develop a winning formula with it. It's been said before and it bears repeating, without the Horsemen there wouldn't have ever been a New World Order, a DX, an Evolution, a Fortune, or any other large heel stable that drew inspiration from it. Number 19, Lou Albano. Though younger fans might only know him as the real-life version of Super Mario, Captain Lou was an integral part of the WWF for several decades. Starting out as a singles wrestler and later forming a tag team with Tony Altomare as the Sicilians, Albano moved to a manager role in 1970 and never looked back. Able to draw an insane amount of heat through his rapid-fire promos and his nefarious actions, Captain Lou managed Ivan Koloff to defeat Bruno Sammartino for the World Championship, snapping a record that lasted for 8 years. Albano would also go on to manage Don Morocco and Greg Valentine at Intercontinental Gold, as well as a whopping 15 teams to the Tag Team Championships. In later years, Albano would become a beloved babyface manager and also help broker the relationship between Cyndi Lauper and the WWF, sparking what would be known as the Rock and Wrestling Connection, which made the Federation a household name. Without the help of Captain Lou, the World Wrestling Federation as we know it may not have turned out the way it did. Number 18, Mick Foley. One of the biggest stars of the Federation's Attitude Era, Mick Foley may go down as one of the most inspirational figures in modern wrestling. Long before signing with the Federation, Foley made a name for himself in WCW, ECW, and Japan, putting his body through tremendous punishment in an effort to amaze the fans and to keep wrestling's mystique alive. He debuted for the WWF in 1996 as the deranged Mankind, continuing to abuse his body in the name of entertainment. By the end of the decade, he'd become one of the company's most endearing figures through his in-ring work, his promos, his character development, and his alternating between his three unique personae: a three-time world champion, a former commissioner, and the man at the center of some of the company's most pivotal moments of the late 90s. His career accomplishments, in spite of traditional wrestling norms, left an incredible impression on millions of fans. Number 17, Vince J. McMahon. Vincent Kennedy McMahon may be responsible for the WWF becoming a global brand, but it was his father, Vincent James McMahon, who laid the groundwork for his son in the first place. A second-generation promoter, the man better known as Vince Sr. ran Capitol Wrestling in the Washington, D.C. area beginning in 1954, after the death of his father, Jess. Capitol Wrestling eventually became the Worldwide Wrestling Federation, then the WWF. Vince Sr. brought his son into the wrestling business at a late age after initially wanting Vince Jr. to have nothing to do with it. Eventually, VKM bought the Federation from his father in 1982, putting his plan of national dominance into motion. The elder Vince never got to see the result of his son's vision as he died of pancreatic cancer in 1984. Number 16, Bobo Brazil. There are few wrestlers who do something truly historic, but in 1962, Bobo Brazil did just that when he became the first black wrestler to win the NWA World Heavyweight Championship against Buddy Rogers. Though the distinction of first black world champion officially goes to Ron Simmons for his accomplishment in 1992, Bobo technically did it first, only for a supposed injury of Rogers to render the decision void. Before this, Brazil was one of the first black wrestlers to break the color barrier, feuding with such men as Killer Kowalski, The Sheik, and Johnny Valentine. He'd also take part in what's considered to be the first racially mixed tag team in 1970, when he and El Mongol wrestled Mr. Ito and the Great Ota. Though he never officially won the big one, Brazil was a very decorated grappler, winning dozens of championships across a career that spanned 4 decades. Number 15, Bret Hart. Hart became the company's top star in the early 1990s after a 1-2 punch of the Federation's steroid scandal and former top names jumping ship. But it's not just his place of prominence in the new generation that makes the Hitman such a worthy Hall of Famer. For many years before this, Bret brought a standard of work ethic and crisp technical mastery to the company, helping him stand out in spite of not being an amazing promo guy. He didn't do a whole lot of flashy things in the ring, but the stuff he did do, no one did better. There was a reason he was given the nickname the Excellence of Execution. Throughout his career, he hardly had a bad match with anyone, but his battles with Shawn Michaels, Steve Austin, Hakushi, Mr. Perfect, The Undertaker, Ric Flair, and his brother Owen definitely stick out as some of the best. After being one of the Federation's most dependable performers for more than a decade, Bret was famously screwed in Montreal and went to WCW, where he'd be criminally underutilized until his forced retirement in the year 2000 due to a concussion. Number 14. Shawn Michaels. For decades, the Heartbreak Kid Shawn Michaels amazed audiences with his flashy skill set and his flamboyant persona. Whether he was teaming with Marty Jannetty or going solo, a good guy or a bad guy, main event or otherwise, in his prime, Shawn was often one of the top guys to watch in the World Wrestling Federation. A 4-time world champion, Shawn's responsible for some of the best matches in WrestleMania history against guys like Razor Ramon, Bret Hart, Kurt Angle, Ric Flair, and The Undertaker. As one of the founding fathers of D-Generation X, HBK was one of the men who helped usher in a new, hip, edgy kind of programming for the company. After taking a 4-year hiatus from wrestling, Shawn returned to full-time competition in late 2002 and entered a career renaissance, lasting all the way until his retirement in 2010, where he never wrestled again. That's our story, and we're sticking to it. Number 13. Billy Graham. A man whose influence wouldn't be fully realized until decades later, superstar Billy Graham was the prototype for the stars of the 80s and 90s. Getting a start in the AWA in 1972, Billy Graham was quickly picked up by the Worldwide Wrestling Federation and would revolutionize the business with his background in bodybuilding, his colorful style, and his liberal use of the word brother. Although his relationship with the McMahon family runs hot and cold to this day, there's no denying Graham's level of importance in the world of wrestling. Number 12. Roddy Piper. A hero is only as good as the villain he fights, and as the World Wrestling Federation began its national expansion, Roddy Piper served as the perfect foil for Hulk Hogan. Brash, unpredictable, and unapologetic, Piper's mad persona clashed perfectly with the Hulkster's good guy character, and it helped draw great business for the company, right up to MTV's War to Settle the Score and the inaugural WrestleMania main event. Piper redefined the wrestling promo, thanks in large part to his Piper's Pit segment, which has led to dozens of copycat interview shows in the decades since. Aside from Hogan, his rivalries with Jimmy Snuka, Bruno Sammartino, Greg Valentine, and Bret Hart are some of the best in wrestling history. Piper was a wild man who blazed his own trail in professional wrestling and lived by his own set of rules, which led to one of the all-time great careers in the industry. Number 11. Bobby Heenan. He's the highest-ranking manager on this countdown, and for good reason. Though there were plenty of managers during the Federation's golden age, none were as good or as omnipresent as Bobby Heenan. More so than most wrestlers, the Weasel was quite possibly Hulk Hogan's greatest rival in the 80s, as Heenan threw monster after monster in front of the Hulkster in an effort to wrest the championship from him. Gifted with one of the sharpest and quickest tongues in wrestling, Heenan's promos were always outlandish in message, yet remained firmly grounded in reality. He didn't need to dress particularly garishly in order to draw the ire of the fans. His actions and his words did that well enough. Heenan would then move to color commentary, a role he perfected alongside Gorilla Monsoon and one he'd play in WCW. For someone who didn't get in the ring every night of the week, Heenan's presence on the World Wrestling Federation product was undeniable, as he was one of the more entertaining characters in company history. Number 10. Dusty Rhodes. A man who was involved in some capacity in every major American organization over the last 50 years, Dusty Rhodes has been considered one of the most influential wrestlers and bookers of all time. Getting his first big break as part of a tag team with Dick Murdoch as the Texas Outlaws, Dusty would eventually achieve great success as a solo act. Despite lacking the physique of more traditional wrestlers, Rhodes captured the hearts and minds of crowds everywhere with his blue-eyed soul and his remarkable charisma. Branding himself as a man of the people, the American Dream would go on to become a wrestler and booker for Jim Crockett Promotions, which eventually became WCW. There he'd have legendary feuds with the Four Horsemen, Terry Funk, Ray Stevens, and more, and would also win the world title on 3 occasions. Apart from the in-ring aspect, Rhodes was instrumental in creating some of the most beloved events and matches in wrestling, from Starrcade to War Games to the Great American Bash, the Bunkhouse Stampede, just to name a few. Of course, he's also known for his run in the WWF during the late 80s and early 90s, some would argue for the wrong reasons. In his final years, he served as the head writer for NXT and was a highly regarded coach and mentor at the Performance Center right up until his death in 2015. Number 9. Buddy Rogers. The original Nature Boy himself, Buddy Rogers was part of the foundation of Vince McMahon Sr.'s WWF. After butting heads with the National Wrestling Alliance and dropping the world title to Lou Thesz, the Federation withdrew from the NWA and crowned Rogers their first world champion, making him the first of 3 men in history to have held both the NWA and WWE championships. Rogers would only hold the title for less than a month, as a heart attack greatly impacted his ability to perform. He lost the championship to Bruno Sammartino in quick fashion and spent the next several years wrestling shorter matches to preserve his health. Rogers would make a brief comeback in the 1970s, passing the torch to Ric Flair and working as a manager and a part-time wrestler in the Federation until the early 1980s. Number 8. Verne Gagne. Though Verne Gagne never actually wrestled for WWE, he's extremely important to the wrestling business at large. An accomplished amateur and professional wrestler in his own right, Verne helped build one of the greatest generations of grapplers in modern history, having trained many men who are also in the Hall of Fame, such as Ric Flair, Ricky Steamboat, the Iron Sheik, Sergeant Slaughter, the Blackjacks, Curt Hennig, and many more. As a promoter, Gagne ran the American Wrestling Association for more than 30 years and ruled the Midwest. He also had a hand in getting Hulkamania off the ground, pushing Hulk Hogan in a main event feud with champion Nick Bockwinkel. His reluctance to pull the trigger on Hogan as champ would ultimately lead to the downfall of his company, as Hulk would jump ship to the World Wrestling Federation along with many other AWA stars, and the rest is history. Number 7. Randy Savage. In the 1980s, the WWF was fortunate enough to have 2 of the biggest and brightest stars in wrestling at the same time, Hulk Hogan and the Macho Man Randy Savage, the 1A and 1B of wrestling, as it were. As a heel, Savage was impossible to ignore, riling the fans up with his bombast and his cowardly use of Miss Elizabeth as a human shield. When he made the transition to babyface and became WWF champion for the first time, the crowd fully embraced it, setting things up perfectly for the explosion of the Mega Powers for WrestleMania 5. With his memorable promos, loud attire, and his combination of technical and brawling prowess, Savage made waves in the Federation until his departure in late 1994, then went on to do okay for himself in WCW. A wrestler who every fan knows, yet is shrouded in a curious mystique, the Macho Man is one of the biggest and most iconic names in the business. Number 6. Ric Flair. There have been so many superlatives used to describe this man over the years it eventually gets old, but when it comes to Ric Flair, that level of praise is more than justified. With his bleached blonde hair, custom suits, Lear jets, limos, and a series of immaculate robes, the Nature Boy epitomizes a level of class and style the rest of the industry has tried to follow since the 1970s. A man who's traveled the world to face the best of the best, Flair officially held the NWA, WCW, and WWF championships 16 times across a 40-plus year career. His bouts with men like Wahoo McDaniel, Ricky Steamboat, Harley Race, Sting, Randy Savage, and Shawn Michaels are the stuff of legend. A perfect combination of in-ring ability, showmanship, and charisma in his heyday, Ric Flair continues to inspire future generations of wrestlers and fans. Number 5. Gorgeous George. As I mentioned before on this channel, Gorgeous George is arguably one of the most pivotal names in wrestling history. Inspired by Lord Patrick Lansdowne, George became one of the first grapplers to adopt an outrageous in-ring persona. Like his contemporary Buddy Rogers, he took full advantage of the advent of television in the 1950s, reaching out to audiences like never before and becoming the most famous wrestler of his time. His wild antics drew crowds everywhere he went, as fans would pay money to see the arrogant showboat get knocked down a peg or two. Not only would the human orchid provide the catalyst for every memorable gimmick to come in wrestling ever since, he also ended up being a huge influence on some of the most transcendent athletes and performers of all time, in particular Muhammad Ali and James Brown. Number 4. Bruno Sammartino. Born in Italy in 1935, Bruno Sammartino and his family escaped German persecution during World War II and emigrated to America. There, young Bruno looked to wrestling and weightlifting as a bully deterrent and eventually grew up to become one of the most revered wrestlers of all time. A cornerstone of what was originally called the Worldwide Wrestling Federation, in 1963, Sammartino beat Buddy Rogers for the world title in less than a minute and went on to hold the championship for a record 7 years and 8 months. Across 2 title reigns, Sammartino held up for a whopping combined 11 years. Continuing to wrestle for the WWF on and off all the way until 1987, Sammartino was a symbol of a simpler time in professional wrestling and a titan of the territory days. Though the Italian strongman defined the company for decades, it seemed as if his Hall of Fame induction would never come due to years of bad blood between he and Vince McMahon. Thankfully, justice was served in 2013 when Bruno officially entered the Hall, an act that was long overdue. Number 3. Steve Austin. Stone Cold Steve Austin was the flag bearer for the WWF during the heyday of the Attitude Era, the man who brought the company to heights not seen since the golden era of the 80s. Even if you ignore his in-ring accomplishments in WCW and ECW before arriving the Federation, his contributions to the company from '97 to 2001 left an indelible mark on the history of the business. From his legendary battles with Bret Hart and Shawn Michaels to his wars with The Undertaker and The Rock, Austin did everything there was to do in the World Wrestling Federation. A King of the Ring, a 3-time Royal Rumble winner, a Triple Crown champion, even a brief spell as the kayfabe CEO of the company. A ratings bonanza, the hero of the most successful storyline in wrestling, and an all-time merch mover, Austin led an age of prosperity in the WWF that paved the way for them to become the publicly traded, multimedia juggernaut it is today. Number 2. Andre the Giant. Hailing from Grenoble in the French Alps, Andre the Giant was a once-in-a-lifetime character in the world of professional wrestling, and perhaps just the world in general. One of the largest men on the planet at that time, Andre sold out arenas all over the world for decades. He rarely stayed in one territory for long before being dragged across the globe to perform in front of more paying crowds. He was a legend, a folk figure of the business, even before the most high-profile rivalry of his storied career. Presented as the most daunting challenge in Hulk Hogan's time as champion, their iconic match drew a record number of fans at the Pontiac Silverdome in 1988 and helped the Federation become the industry giant it is today. Andre was the standard bearer of what a big man in professional wrestling should be, and is practically a deity in WWE canon. And the number 1 WWE Hall of Famer is Hulk Hogan. You've heard his name a fair number of times already on this countdown, but now we're finally going to talk about the man himself. Let's face it, if it weren't for Hulk Hogan, there would be no WWE, at least not one we'd recognize today. The man who main evented the first 9 WrestleManias, Hogan was arguably the first global megastar of professional wrestling, the first one to fully integrate with popular culture as the Federation made its big expansion in the 80s. If Vince Jr.'s WWF were like Marvel Comics, Hogan was Captain America, the golden hero to jumpstart this whole enterprise. For millions of wrestling fans and for thousands of wrestlers, their earliest memories of wrestling include Hulk Hogan, whether he rocked the red and yellow or the black and white with the NWO. He'd go on to influence wrestling across 2 decades, 3 if you count his time in Impact Wrestling. Simply put, you can't have a WWE Hall of Fame without the wrestler most responsible for the industry's meteoric rise in popularity in the 1980s and again in the late 1990s. And that's why Hulk Hogan is the number 1 WWE Hall of Famer. Oh God. Finally done. Finally done. Well, I'm sure you have a lot to say about these rankings, which I reiterate are extremely subjective, so feel free to sound off on them in the comment section below. I'm Brian Zane, and I'll see you next time.